Hi, this is Paul. There wasn't a video today because Monday was Labor Day, and I did a bunch of writing for CRC Voices in the morning, and then my wife and I went to the beach for the afternoon. The puppy had never seen the ocean, so it's always fun taking uh, a year-old now puppy to the ocean and having it discover the waves and everything. So it was a great day, and yeah, it was wonderful. But there's been a ton of video stuff out lately, and there's a bunch of backlog stuff I really want to get to. But I want to start with the Benjamin Boyce, Jordan Hall conversation. It was a great conversation. It was a great conversation. And there's so much in it. I saw that Chad has been sort of working over it a bit, but I wanted to jump in here because as the election gets closer, the anxiety of the nation rises, and there's a lot of apocalyptic vision out there. And I think actually, Jordan Hall has been around the corner now quite a bit for a while, so most of us have heard his story and are familiar with it. I thought he set it out nicely for Benjamin Boyce, who perhaps wasn't as familiar with it. But I thought this section of sort of differentiating Hall from the Weinstein brothers was really helpful.
So if you think like geometrically, an invasive species is operating ultimately at the same energetic level as all of the other organisms.
So now he's talking about how technology basically disrupts the myriad of systems that we depend upon. This is where he goes from a crisis to a polycrisis. There are all these different crises. He talks about the fact that after, when he sort of rode the wave up on a tech boom, began to hobnob with people of various other disciplines, began to notice that they were all working on these various crises, any one of which would be a real calamity that it seems that the world would not be able to sort of easily absorb. And then recognizing that, oh my goodness, all of these crises are not only crises in and of themselves, most of which we have very little idea of, but what they would also tend to have is a domino effect and just really sort of topple everything over. So very much an apocalyptic vision. So he's talking about the disruption, how human technology is so powerful it disrupts in ways that, let's say, another invasion of a species doesn't.
That are in that niche, right? So they happen to be, call it 10 times more effective, but not 1,000 times more effective. And what happens is that by virtue of technology, right, which is a novel phenomenon in reality, we're able to get much larger multiples of effectiveness. And therefore, that which drags us back into equilibrium is a different kind of thing. Traditionally, the way we've done it is we've had civilization collapse. That's actually been the traditional solution to the problem.
Yeah.
And it works. It actually brings us back down into something which is more in equilibrium with our environment, which, by the way, also shakes up a bunch of stuff in culture that was going off in crazy places, because when culture is unconstrained by feedback loops, it has a tendency to just go off into madness.
And it needs to be cold.
Traditionally, it has to be cold.
Yeah.
Okay, and you can look at like the Bronze Age collapse, and you can look at various civilizational collapses around the world and say, again, this is sort of building on his thesis. I'm summarizing earlier parts of the video where he just basically walks through, and a little bit later when he talks about sanity. Again, the definition of sanity is moving from sort of a individualistic psychological concept to much more of a communal concept. Sanity, and actually he's got a really nice definition of sanity in here. Sanity is basically one's ability to productively engage with reality. Now, when I say reality, everyone sort of defers to their worldview, and so materialists would say, okay, base reality, but reality is this complex, it's the totality of one's worldview. Let's say it's the whole show, as C.S. Lewis would call it.
But the game A thesis is we're in one of those, like we're sort of proximal to a Bronze Age collapse kind of event. But what's novel about where we are is that for the first time ever in human history, the entire world is entrained, deeply entrained, in a single civilization system. And the magnitude of the distance of that civilization system is like 6 orders of magnitude more intense, both in terms of population and in terms of the amount of energy flux through the system.
Yeah. Okay.
So we would be looking at something that would be something like a global scale, 1 million times as intense Bronze Age collapse.
And of course, this is not an unbelievable story, given the fact that a virus like COVID, which in the end has become something that we are all living with. Just this week at church, such and such and such a person has COVID. No, I just had it. It was like a cold, yada, yada, yada. COVID significantly disrupted the world. But when you think about a much more, higher order collapses, let's say thermonuclear war or something, they're all of the fears that there have been with respect to climate change and this and that and this and that. You're looking at the kind of a collapse that would really disrupt things. And of course, we see some things regionally. You watch other videos. There's something going on in Bangladesh now in terms of their government's collapse. And Bangladesh has so many people that if these people sort of spread and move out, they can destabilize other nations. You've got Pakistan, you've got India, and well, what happens then? So it's I say, oh, Pastor, we had 2 world wars in the 20th century, and the second one ended not with a nuclear exchange, but with the detonation of 2 nuclear bombs. There's a reason the world is anxious. We have the Cuban Missile Crisis, which very well could have ended in a nuclear exchange. We currently have the Ukraine war, where there's always the anxiety that, well, will Russia use a tactical nuke? And if Russia uses a tactical nuke, then what? And so there are plenty of reasons to be anxious. What if in fact, ocean temperatures change sufficiently that some of the patterns that have sort of governed our weather begin to significantly shift, or all kinds of things. And this is where when he talks about the fact that a lot of people who know a lot of things look at one thing, the little silo they do know, and they say, yeah, I remember I had a student who got his PhD in environmental engineering, and he did his PhD work on invasive species in California, and he noted that if you take a small little organism, let's say, and you put it in a water bottle, in a plastic water bottles, the kind of plastic water bottles that we drink out of, the hormone-like things leach out of the plastic and impact that tiny little creature. And then you see the fact that, well, how many people are drinking these water bottles, and do any of these hormones have any impact in, let's say, the reproduction and mentality? This stuff goes on and on and on and on and on. And so if you want a long list of conspiracy theories, just go find Grim Grizz. He'll be happy to offer them to you.
And of course, that looks it's hard to know exactly how bad that would be. Arguments are that it's an extinction event, others that it brings us back down to the Paleolithic age. The likelihood that we stop at kind of like the steam age or the kind of mid 1800s is very, very, very low, but non-zero. But somewhere in that trajectory, you can measure it a bunch of different ways, like what is the inverse Metcalfe's law in population collapse in terms of the economic possibility? What are ways of mapping it? But there's other characteristics like the oceans are depleted. Fish aren't as easy to catch. There's no coal at the surface. There's no oil at the surface. There's no metals at the surface. Well, yeah, but there's a lot of metals concentrated, so there's a lot of work on, or not work. Many people have thought about that, but the bottom line is really bad, right? Really bad. Super bad, like bad enough that it reaches the mythological level. Like it starts to feel very apocalyptic. I've started taking on.
So then all these dreams that we've had in movies and been making movies about collapse that we've had for a very long time, something happens and suddenly these things come true. And of course, part of us is like, well, this stuff would never come true. And of course, what happens is never what we imagine, but hey, really bad things have happened in humanity for a very long time. And the fact that our current civilizational cycle has let's say, written records, we discover many, many things that have no written records. And it's like, wow, something big happened here. I bet you a lot of people died. There's like no trace of this civilization. You find this kind of thing all over the place in the world. But again, they tend to be little localized civilizations. And why did they collapse? Who killed them? What happened to this? And of course, even in the in the last few hundred years, we've had the Columbian Exchange, which led to the eradication of the existent civilizations in the Americas, displaced by European civilizations that came over, and then some sort of mixture that developed into the civilizations we have now. So things fall apart.
On the term that I'm a practical eschatologist.
Okay.
Yeah, and so from that point, the work was, can we do anything about it? And if so, what is a vision that is equal in magnitude to the magnitude of the problem? And the way I've talked about this to some people is like, look, if you're on, let's say you're sitting on a ship, on a boat, and the boat is sinking, and the toilet is broken. If you fix the toilet, you've done something, you fixed the toilet, but that's really not the problem you should be focusing on. And it doesn't solve the bigger problem at all. But if you haven't got a vision that's able to be aware of the fact that the real problem is the boat is sinking, and your attention is focused on the local problem you can grasp, everybody's going to be fixing toilets.
Now, part of where we're going to go with this, in a little bit, he's going to talk about this fork that happened. He's basically set up the conversation between game A and game B. He's talked about this in other videos. You can find Brett Weinstein talking about game B. You can find Jim Rutt talking about game B. So this is something that happened a little while ago, and he's sort of telling his story. And so he's talking about what happened to this game B community that was basically looking at all of these issues. But even his little story about, let's say, the ship is sinking and fixing the toilet. The ship that we are on right now is so massive that maybe fixing the toilet is at least something you can do. And there's really very little you can do with respect to the far larger ship going down. So that's something to think about.
And so that was, can we, and that's not easy. Like, it's not at all easy to think about what does it look like. It's bizarrely impossible.
I should be able, oh gosh, I don't remember what video was on. Neil Daedalus made a really good comment, and I don't remember what video it was in. I don't know if I could find it. Neil might be able to find it, but he basically saw this dichotomy, and he asked himself. He said, you know what? There's sort of a new blinder system that we are putting on ourselves with respect to some things, because you can see this apocalypticism, and many people are sort of gripped by it, and it's anxiety producing for them. And some people get basically frozen by that anxiety. And let's say if you were frozen in fear in 1963 by the Cuban Missile Crisis, which it was a very, very dangerous situation that happened there. What happened if, let's say, you could no longer, let's say, care for your children? Or you could no longer participate, you could no longer go to work. In other words, there's a question of proximity here. And now, in a few minutes, he's going to sort of bring that together in terms of a fork in the road of the Game B community, in terms of approaches to the problems that we're facing.
Nearly. What does it look like to construct something or come up with a way of responding to this that is equal in magnitude? Because we're talking about a problem that is, again, 10,000 years or bigger. And that, by the way, is the fork historically, and sort of the way that trajectory worked, where, say, Brett went one way and I went another way, because that's where the meaning crisis starts to kick into the conversation.
In other words, okay, you take a look at the magnitude of the things that impact us, and you have to say to yourself, okay, what do I do now?
from my point of view, the sort of psycho-spiritual piece is at least as important as the socio-technical piece, and they're because they're at the very least tightly coupled, and that because we use the psycho-spiritual piece to think about anything, we can't just use the existing psycho-spiritual thing that we're working with to try to think about the problem. We've got to do this crazy thing, which is to teleport out of our minds, not into insanity, but into something else that can actually respond to the reality that we're in.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so he sort of sets sort of the psycho-spiritual piece and the technical-political piece. He sort of sets them apart, and he makes the observation that this is, of course, where the meaning crisis comes in, that you if you're actually going to be able to make any progress in the techno-political space, you really have to make sure that the psycho-spiritual space is, at least to the best that you can fathom, in order, because you actually use that to engage the other. In other words, if you put the techno-political space first, and you haven't addressed the psycho-spiritual space, you're not going to get anywhere, because you're not going to be dealing with sanity. And he's right about that. Now, when you look at so often when we hear John Vervaeke talk about a meaning crisis, I think our implicit individualism sort of brings it down close to us. Say, okay, you're watching individuals having crises of meanings, and of course, when lots of individuals have crises of meanings, these things will bubble up and they'll become technical, political issues. There's no question about that. And so one of the ways to address civilization collapse is, well, I might not be able to do much about the whole ship. Maybe I should fix that toilet, because I really do need to keep my own house in order. And maybe the question of whether or not I fix the toilet isn't so much the technical problem of the toilet flushing itself. Maybe it's more the question of how, in fact, do I manage myself, set priorities, what, in fact, is shaping the basic functionality of my engagement with reality. And again, reality, if you're not a scientific materialist, reality goes far beyond laws of physics. It's so funny. Laws of physics, yeah. The world is just material. Then there's these laws of physics that govern it. Are those laws material? Did we write them down someplace? I mean, how? Anyway, and so I think Jordan is right, and Jordan, of course, has now moved into the Christian fold himself. And well, let's play a little bit more.
Yeah.
All right. That was like the next arc of my life.
Yeah. So where do you aim to not hit sanity? If you're literally you live inside of order, and outside of order is chaos, and you know that out there could be a place of silence where you could view order or review order.
Yeah.
Where do you start to aim your attention, or what are the building blocks of that?
That's a great question. Wow. So let's see. By the way, are we recording this? Yeah, we are. Neat.
Yeah. Sorry. I'm not gonna let this go to waste.
The answer. Let me see if I can give you the most compact answer, which is, by the way, not the way I did it. So I'm trying to give you the benefit of my experience.
Oh yeah. Okay.
So the first order. Can you critique? Can you find a critique that allows you to get some sense of what wrong answers look like? That's helpful. And so, for example, McGilchrist's critique is very helpful. He's able to say, hey, look, anything that is sort of clearly or likely the result of a deeply left brain dominant point of view is the kind of thing that you're not going to find the right answer in. So, and the inverse of that actually turns out to be, and something that seems to be more in a whole brain way of looking at it is likely useful. So heuristically, think about that, like work in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it goes for a while. But you get my point that basically Jordan Hall has said there's fundamentally a procedural question that you have to engage with. And I think he's right. Well, you're a pastor, of course you think he's right. And even though part of what being part of a community and a culture is that you inherit a set of priorities that you never in your short little lifetime would have been able to generate. That's basically how humans work with cultures. Humans in a healthy culture set up their children to further the entire enterprise. Now, I have not yet watched much of Eric again on Chris Williamson. And Eric, of course, has been on Rogan recently. Eric has been doing the rounds. He started the portal, but he abandoned that project fairly quickly. And my guess is that he decided that it's his bang for the buck. It's simply easier to get himself on bigger podcasts. And so after one day with the title of Are We on the Brink of a Revolution? And a thumbnail with the words of complete systemic collapse, 1 million views in one day, probably, a pretty reasonable decision to, further this approach. And what's so interesting about listening to Jordan Hall on Benjamin Boyce, and of course Eric Weinstein has far larger Twitter following, far larger footprint out there. And if you look at Eric and Brett in terms of where they went in this, someone might say, well, it certainly seems to be a better approach. But I was struck after listening to, really thinking about Jordan Hall on Benjamin Boyce, then, because I got a chance to watch some of Grim Grizz's members only viewing of some parts of this video, and Grim picked some good parts to view. And of course, Grim always has some super insightful ways into something like this, and really clever critiques. If you can get through all of the unwatchability of Grim Grizz, which I love, and then just have it start this way in comparison to the other.
When we spoke at the start of the year, I said it was way too close to November to switch anybody out. Turns out that I was wrong.
Beginner's luck.
You said, what are the odds that Joe Biden has a debilitating event between now and November, including death? So he runs a 1 in 20 chance of dying in any given year or above, that I don't think you know whether he's even going to make it to November. Debilitating event could have been a debilitating public event.
I purposely left it vague, and I didn't say the other part of it, which I now feel comfortable saying, which is I don't know whether Donald Trump will be allowed to become president.
What do you mean by that?
I think that there's a remarkable story, and we're in a funny game, which is, are we allowed to say what that story is? Because to say it, to analyze it, to name it, is to bring it into view. I think we don't understand why the censorship is behaving the way it is. We don't understand why it's in the shadows. We don't understand why our news is acting in a bizarre fashion. So let's just set the stage, given that that was in February. There is something that I think Mike Benz has just referred to as the rules-based international order. It's an interlocking series of agreements, tacit understandings, explicit understandings, clandestine understandings about how the most important structures keep the world free of war and keep markets open. And there has been a system in place, whether understood explicitly or behind the scenes or implicitly, that says that the purpose of the two American parties is to prune the field of populist candidates so that whatever two candidates exist in a face-off are both acceptable to that world order. So what you're trying to do from the point of view, let's take it from the point of view of, let's say, the State Department, the intelligence community, the Defense Department. And
all right, we can pause it there. You get my point. Right into the election. And what's so funny is that America seemed to have forgotten. I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which, this isn't covered up. And Rick just stopped by to pick up a piece of equipment today that he's working on to try and improve things here. And he told me about a Supreme Court decision that I hadn't heard at all and hadn't covered at all. And he says, this is a really big deal. And I thought, yeah, it really is. So we have such little understanding of the ship that we're on and the relative aspects of it. And one of the things that I often think people forget is Donald Trump was president for 4 years already. And I'm not saying, what should happen in the next election, but people talk as if that didn't happen. And it did. And COVID started under him. And maybe you like the way he handled it. Maybe you don't like the way he handled it. Maybe you liked his policies. Maybe you don't like his policies. Vote for whoever you want to. I don't really care. But when I look at Jordan Hall's approach, and what Jordan Hall's approach asked me to do is say, okay, where do you put your attention? Where do you place your heart? What do you get anxious about? So you can, I'll pick this up where Grim Grizz picked it up.
Brazen cutting together of something that millions of people have seen.
They don't really, whatever it is not really trying to fool you. It's trying to instruct you. You're allowed to see the truth. They can make it difficult to find the truth, but it's hard to shut up Joe Rogan. They've settled for something else, which is, think about MSNBC and CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Reuters, AP, etc., as a set of instructions for how to keep your job. You're allowed to disagree. We'll set the boundaries of the disagreement. We'll set the topics of the disagreement. You may not even watch any of these things, but we'll make sure that it filters through to the people that you are watching so that they're outraged. And you're given a choice. You can choose to understand whatever you want, and you can choose to say whatever you want. But if you say what you understand to be true, you can know what the consequences are. You may lose your marriage. You may lose your job. You may lose your friends. And so, in essence, we all know that if you question the war in Ukraine, or if you say, look, I detest Donald Trump, but I'm voting for him because what's going on in the Democratic Party is unholy and insane, you're signing up for whatever Thanksgiving dinner we have planned for you. We're talking to your uncle. We're talking to your spouse. And in essence, this is a lot like Caligula installing his horse as a senator. No one's fooled that the horse is an ordinary human senator. The choice is, do you wish to say something?
And basically he's just given us the definition of a culture. Because this is what a culture is. And this is how a culture works. And this is where we get back to Jordan Hall's point that what's way down deep is a question of, okay, what do you say and what are the costs? Now, back when I first heard about Game B, this was a while ago, and I used it for some sermon stuff. I was starting the Sermon on the Mount. And at that point, the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' most famous sermon. There's a whole lot that's in there. Jesus, it seems, because in Luke you have the Sermon on the Plain. It's similar to Sermon on the Mount. Jesus, quite likely, as he walked around as an itinerant, he would probably, as most itinerants do, use some lines over and over, use some stories over and over, use some teachings and some images over and over. So it could well be that what Matthew has done is accumulated everything into the Sermon on the Mount to give a really nice example of what Jesus would do when he would come into a place. And of course, it's on a mountain, and so you've got all the symbolism, yada, yada, yada. The Sermon on the Mount, this was in the 1980s. You can find this in the Reformed Journal. I might be able to pull it up. A professor who was connected to the Reformed Journal community was teaching English at Texas A&M and decided to hand out the Sermon on the Mount to her students. Now, again, this is in the 80s in Texas, so one might assume at least a degree of biblical literacy among the group. Handed it out to her students and asked them to read it and write a little reflection paper. And these are the kinds of answers she got. The stuff the churches preach is extremely strict and allows for almost no fun without thinking, or it's a sin. I did not like the Sermon on the Mount. It was hard to read and made me feel like I had to be perfect, and no one is. The things asked in the sermon are absurd. To look at a woman as adultery? That is the most extreme, stupid, unhuman statement I have ever read. At this point, I began to be encouraged. There was something exquisitely innocent about not realizing you shouldn't call Jesus stupid. This is not exactly intellectual agnosticism talking here, usually the perceived foe of faith. It is just down-home hedonism. It was Herod watching Salome dance. It was the disciples asking who then can be saved when Jesus deflated the dreams of wealth with the needle's eye. This was the real thing, a pristine response to the gospel unfiltered through a 2 millennia cultural haze. Another interesting thing about the Sermon on the Mount is that this is part of the reason I'm super interested in hearing Peterson and his crew handle the Sermon on the Mount. And Peterson, I think he's planning on writing a book about Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount. I'm very interested in hearing what he does with that, because this is what Craig Bloomberg, a New Testament scholar, says about the Sermon on the Mount. Perhaps no other religious discourse in the history of humanity has attracted the attention which has been devoted to the Sermon on the Mount. Philosophers and activists from all non-Christian perspectives have refused to worship Jesus, nevertheless have admired his ethic. In the 20th century, Mahatma Gandhi was the sermon's most famous non-Christian devotee. Literature on the sermon is vast. One recent survey has itemized 36 different interpretations. Only 8 of the most significant and influential approaches can be listed here. Since at least medieval times, many have seen 2 levels of ethics in Jesus' teaching, with the sermon reflecting the stricter requirements for those who would pursue a higher level of righteousness among clergy and monastic orders, 2-speed religion, as Charles Taylor would say. In Luther's widely influential approach, the sermon functions as a law does for Paul. God's impossible moral demands disclose the depths of our sinfulness and drive us to our knees in repentance. 3. Many Anabaptists applied the sermon's ethics as an extremely literal fashion to the civic sphere and endorsed full-fledged pacifism. So in other words, Reformed tended to read the book and think about, okay, well, this is how we should think about it. And the Anabaptists are like, no, this is what we have to apply. We have to hold fast to what Jesus said to do. Protestant liberals have seen the sermon as a paradigm for the social gospel and a call to the church to usher the kingdom of God on earth, a view also adopted in secular form by Karl Marx. Existentialists have rejected any of the sermon's ethics as absolute, but view them as rather a profound challenge to personal decisions to live in the consciousness of human finitude and divine encounter. Albert Schweitzer's interim ethic also relativized the sermon by finding it an unique urgency that remained only as long as the first church, like Jesus, mistakenly believed that he would turn in their lifetime. Dispensationalism has classically limited the sermon's ethic to a future millennial kingdom, which Jesus offered to the Jews, but which they rejected, so that it was postponed until after his second coming. Peugeot and company would talk about initiation. You need to be initiated into being able to have the proper understanding of this. And of course, Protestantism is like, no, here's the text. See what God says through it and go and do so. So a whole lot going on with this. But again, part of the challenge that we are seeing now is that for most of us on this massive ship of fools, we have no idea what to think about anything. And the more that you sort of try to penetrate it, the more you begin to realize, how much can I really know? And so then we decide, well, right now, in a bunch of the channels that I watch, sometimes they advertise ground news. And so ground news is, maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. I don't know. I haven't looked it up. Sometimes I see the ad and think, I should look that up. Haven't done so. Why not? I don't know. Because so many other interesting things in this life, rather than chasing down news sources from around the world to try to approximate for myself a proper frame of reference in order to add one vote one way or another in a state where California's as blue as this shirt, baby. This California is going to vote for Harris, as it would have voted for Biden. It doesn't matter. That's the way it's going to go. And the president of the United States will probably be picked by Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Georgia, etc., etc. Part of the reason I'm so behind on some YouTube watching is because I don't usually watch these guys. I usually listen to them. As I'm trying to catch up to the rest is history. I got behind while I was in Italy, and I just made my way through the start of the First World War, which I found to be very interesting, and I have plenty of thoughts about that. But now they're in the French Revolution, and let's see, I'm at 35. I want to start at the beginning because Dominic, I think, really opens this well.
There are other things that compete. The Russian Revolution, most obviously.
Or the American Revolution.
The French Revolution is the central political event in modern history. There are other things that compete. The Russian Revolution, most obviously.
Or the American Revolution, but I agree, neither of those really compare.
No. To me, the French Revolution is the paradigmatic example of people trying to reboot a society, to make it again, to make something new. So it's that on the one hand. And then, of course, there are other dimensions to it. It becomes the great crucible of conservatism. It's in response to the French Revolution that Edmund Burke writes the most famous example of kind of literary conservatism in history. It's Reflections on the Revolution in France. It's the French Revolution that exports the idea of the nation and of modern nationalism across Europe and arguably the world. And its iconography, Tom, we're still so familiar with it. I mean, obviously, it gave France its national anthem. It gave it its flag, the tricolor flag. But the ideas of the idea of left and right comes from the French Revolution, from where people sat.
In the National Assembly, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And when you think about all the great writing that's been done on it, even just in English, Dickens is A Tale of Two Cities, one of the most influential books on our perception of history that has ever been written. We mentioned Burke.
Dickens influenced by Carlyle and his great History of the Revolution.
And of all the history books that have been written in our lifetimes, one of the most influential on the way people write history, I think, is Simon Schama's book, Citizens. Some listeners may not agree with Schama's take on the revolution. His take is actually not dissimilar from Margaret Thatcher's, because he very much emphasizes the violence and the costs of the revolution. But the way he did it, the emphasis on narrative, and his ability to take unexpected aspects and to take byroads and to make them so richly fascinating and colourful.
That's his great genius as a writer, isn't it?
Yeah, but that had an enormous impact on other historians.
I mean, it's a reflection of the inherent drama and the scale and the sweep of the French Revolution that it has inspired such great writers. So there's Hilary Mantel as well. Her first great historical novel was about the French Revolution.
Actually, it's, for me, her best book. Well, one of her, certainly her best historical book. No, I think it's... And what makes it so interesting is not just the high drama, but obviously the questions. Why did it all happen? And even more than that.
Well, Dominic, we've answered that. It's because of the diamond necklace scandal.
Right. So we can stop right now.
Yeah, we've solved it.
So to be very, very simplistic for us.
All right, so blue just looks good if you got bald white dudes. I'm sorry, it just does. That's why I think all the bald white dudes are wearing blue shirts, especially if you got a whole bunch of white hair. The French Revolution, and not so long ago, enormously studied. But what they did nicely is that they took a step back and said even what we consider to be history. So now we're not only talking about, let's say, meaning crisis individual. We're talking about sense making crises. How can we sort of make sense of the world? How can we kind of fit things together? How can one way or another we sort of figure out how to navigate our way in the world? Now they go through quite a bit here. Let me see if I can jump in. So France is the major power in Europe in many ways. It's historically got large population, and France, in fact, has been tweaking in a whole bunch of things, and they do a nice job of sort of debunking a lot of ideas about the aristocracy was the monarchy was unthinking and uncaring, but what you see is just these rise of certain movements, including this thing, basically the public opinion or the public idea, or this hive mind that becomes that develops in the public and begins to move and change things. So let's jump in here.
We need more representation. Basically, we don't want to carry the can for the tax increases. You have to get a bigger body to do it. Calonne is really furious about this, and now he does something that is actually disastrous from the perspective of the French monarchy. He goes public. He seeks to rouse the people. He sends a pamphlet out to every priest in the city in Paris, and he says, you have to read this to your congregation, your Sunday sermons. He has it reprinted in gazettes. He has it read out on street corners and read aloud to the crowds in Les Halles, in the big markets. And this thing, he tells people, France is at a crossroads. Finances are in a total mess. Either we have total change or total collapse. And in this pamphlet, he uses a lot of the language that anticipates the revolution. So he's using terms like the national will, patriotism. He says, the privileged will be sacrificed. Yes, when justice requires it and need demands it. Would it be better to tax again the unprivileged, the people? And that kind of language, people haven't heard that from French royal finance ministers before. He's anticipating a lot of the terms that will be used in the revolution. Now, when he comes out with all this, the notables go absolutely ballistic. How dare you rouse the people against us?
And so they complain to Louis about him.
So they complain to Louis, and Louis, as is always the way, Louis sacks him. Sorry, mate, you've got to go.
People don't like the notables don't like it.
The notables don't like it. As Sharma says in Citizens, by taking his case to the public, Calonne had made politics a matter of national attention. Once Pandora's box had been opened in this way, it proved impossible to close the lid. After Calonne, anything was possible.
We love a Pandora's box.
I like the fact that Sharma's gone for Pandora's box.
So the Pandora's box has been opened, and the storm clouds of revolution are
Definitely
gathering.
they are. Now, the trouble is that the debate has started. A public debate. People are talking about this in cafes, on street corners and things. And as amazing as it may sound to many listeners, most people take the notable side, the side of the very privileged people who don't want to pay more taxes. So Robert Darnton quotes journalists of the day. Our notables, which were thought to be puppets or courtiers, are for the most part well-informed patriots who know the true interests of the nation. Because the one thing that people are really worried about is not the fact that nobles don't pay taxes. It is they have a dread of an overweening autocratic monarchy. So the nobles are very good at posing as the defenders of the French people's liberties, and people believe it. People are roused by it.
But they're kind of riding a crocodile, right?
They are. Oh, totally. Yeah, the notables are in for a shock. So now Louis has to find a new finance minister, and he says, "Well, what I'll do is I'll get one of the notables to do it." I mean, that's quite a canny idea.
All right, I have to jump. This isn't exactly the portion. Here's a great item of audience capture in the French Revolution.
He points out the judges are carried aloft by the crowd, the Parlement judges, but he says it's not clear at this point. Are they the leaders? They're not the leaders of the riot. They're more like it's kind of its trophies, a bit like the stuffed eagle, but they're also kind of its prisoners.
Right, and this is something that will happen again and again. So, I mean, looking ahead, it's an experience that the royal family will soon be
Exactly.
experiencing.
And some of the older judges are very anxious about this and end up actually leaving the city. They don't want to be associated with this. But there's a younger generation who are enthused and actually see in the disorder and the collapse of royal authority a chance to lead, to profit. And the classic example of this is a guy who I think you can argue is the first true French revolutionary leader. So he's a young judge from Grenoble, and he's called Jean-Joseph Mounier. And he is just such a perfect example of a French revolutionary leader. He's the son of a cloth merchant. He's upwardly mobile. He's 29, so he's young, as so many of them were.
And he's a lawyer. Yeah.
They're all lawyers.
They're all lawyers, aren't they? They're all young lawyers.
And he's really ambitious. They're basically like our Athelstan members, Tom. They're young lawyers of the Rest is History Club. French revolutionaries in waiting. So he has bought the office of a royal judge, and he has actually become a he's on the lowest possible rank of the nobility.
And isn't that always the way, classically, in a revolution, that it's the people, it's not the poor, it's always the upwardly mobile who haven't got quite upwardly mobile enough.
Exactly. And he sees this as a chance to jump up the ladder and to turn the ladder into his ladder. So he convenes a huge meeting on the 21st of July, 1788, outside Grenoble at the Château de Vizelle. The Château de Vizelle, if you go there today, it is the world's only museum of the French Revolution, and there's a reason for that. Because you can argue again, this is one of the absolute places where the French Revolution began.
Well,
a year before
if you are the Grenoble Tourist Board.
If you're the Grenoble Tourist Board, exactly. And at this meeting, he says, listen, we want free elections. We want the Estates General of Dauphiné, each province to have its own Estates General. And when that's going to meet, and when that meets, the third estate, the Commons, should have the same numbers as the other two estates, the Lords and the clergy put together, and they should all sit in one chamber, not multiple chambers like they have in Britain, Lords and Commons, all one chamber, so that the Commons can dominate. In other words, majority rule, the general will dominate over the privileges of the old order. And a lot of historians say that is so groundbreaking and seismic that is the true kickoff point for the revolution, the chain of events that will lead to the revolution. And there's two other things that I think are really revealing about that meeting at Vizelle. First of all is the language is so 1793. It's all about patriotic fire, sacrifices. The law should be the expression of the general will. But the other thing is there is a darker side to it. So this, for the first time, these people say our opponents we are patriots, but our opponents are traitors to the patrie, and they should be treated accordingly.
Because there's a kind of incipiently totalitarian quality to saying that you are the embodiment of the nation.
Definitely there is, Tom.
Because if you are the embodiment of the nation, your enemies therefore aren't, and by definition are traitors.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I totally agree. Now, of course, you can say there's a great irony here, that actually even Mounier and his friends have not really understood what happened in Grenoble that riotous day. They think, because they've been chaired aloft by the crowd, they think they're going to control it. And they are, of course, dead wrong. And some of these people are going to end up dead, and literally dead. But I think what makes it so revealing is that it is indicative of this change in the language and the sentiment that is happening in 1788. Previously, all that stuff was about the old liberties of the French, that the government, a modernizing government, is trying to squash. But in 1788, you can see that language changing, and people are now saying, let's actually do something new. Who cares about the past? We can use this opportunity to draw up a new constitution. Sharma gives a brilliant example of a lawyer called Volney, who wrote a journal called The Sentinel of the People. What does it matter to us what our fathers have done or how and why they have done it? The essential rights of man, his natural relations to his fellows in the state of society, these are the basis of any form of government. So in other words, that they're going to take that, the idea of starting again, and they take the passion, the idea of virtue, all of that, and that gives them, you could argue, what Robert Darnton calls a radically simplified view of politics.
And also, it's very contrary to the way that the Constitution has evolved in Britain, where the whole point of the relationship of the monarchy to the House of Lords and the House of Commons has evolved over time and is rooted in the deep past.
Yeah.
And so therefore you can already see that Britain is starting to fade as a model for the more radical proponents of a new constitution.
But also what is so interesting is it is also different from the American constitution makers, because they're basically, the American constitution makers are slightly trapped within the British mindset. So there, it's about the separation of powers. They want to ensure against a kind of mob democracy. They want to ensure against somebody having too much power. It's kind of, their constitution is hedged about with kind of nuances and qualifications. The French revolutionists have no time for that. Sharma quotes a guy who was a friend of Rousseau's called the Comte d'Entraigues, who said, the people is the state itself. By the immutable laws of nature, the people is everything. Everything should be subordinated to the people. That is not how British Whig politicians spoke. It's not really how American colonists spoke. This sense of, it's very simple. There's us, the side of virtue and patriotism and liberty,
And the nation.
and then there's them, despotism and depredations and corruption and all of that sort of stuff, and traitors. So right there, even before the fall of the Bastille, you've got the lines being drawn very starkly. Now, meanwhile, Mr. Brienne with his pustules.
Okay. Just notice the nation. Well, what is this nation? It's the nation. It's public opinion. It's you have the rise of all of these things coming to bear. Now, you're going to jump at that level and you're going to monkey around with it, and you're just sure about how it reads. But I think Jordan Hall is right that you have to sort of come way back down and say you might be right there where the looking down and seeing the iceberg and saying or you might be somewhere below decks having dinner or talking to your spouse or what have you. How are you the basic formation that you're going to need to develop is not just sort of a positional, these are our positions. Another take on the Sermon on the Mount is Dallas Willard's The Divine Conspiracy, Rediscovering Our Hidden Life in God. Dallas Willard, of course, taught philosophy at USC for many years, passed away a number of years ago. And basically, his point was, and I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, you can live in all different sorts of times and places. And people do. People live in all the different times and places where people live. And maybe you will have a chance to move something in the French Revolution or the American Revolution or whatever's going to happen in November of 2024 or. But the one thing that you cannot escape is yourself. And so the formation of that self that you are is sort of the axis mundi. This is the pivotal space in which, depending on who you are and who you are being formed to be, regardless of what positions you hold about this or that or what ideas you hold, and how well you can sort of navigate through the sense-making maze that we are confronted with today. How are you supposed to know the truth about this or that? Well, maybe you're just going to adopt a posture of suspicion. One of the things that we talked about at our estuary this Sunday was trust. Trust is a funny thing, and in many ways, so much of what we are voluntary, the scheduled programming, as Grim Grizz says, that we are voluntarily submitting ourselves to, is undermining our capacity to trust. But you always trust someone, and you always don't trust someone else. But if you do not have the capacity to trust, you actually can't live. The newborn baby who cannot trust enough to nurse from its mother will die of starvation. The person who cannot trust enough to form meaningful, productive human relationships will live lonely, frustrating, angry, bitter lives. And the truth is that something may come and take you. It might be a nuclear war, might be a germ, might be a car that runs a red light. We are victims of our success, and that many of us live in societies where we live life with a degree of agency, with a degree of prosperity, with a degree of comfort that is unprecedented in human history.
When you give someone sourdough bread, because it shows you have and can maintain a sourdough starter, which is a big flex because it takes a lot of time.
Yeah, so we've got little flexes like this today, but interestingly, the core flexes that I think people engage in today, which shows, I think, a true post-scarcity world, is stuff like you giving out eggs from our backdoor chicken coop and stuff like that.
Yeah, okay, that's my flex.
Or sourdough bread or something that, you cooked and made at home. They're flexes which demonstrate that you don't need to rely on the industrialized economy. Yet we cannot forget how much easier the industrialized economy has made our lives. And here I'll have some stats about absolute poverty rates in places like the United States, as well as starvation rates. So if we're looking at poverty rates in the United States, in the early 1900s, poverty was extremely widespread, affecting between 40 and 60% of Americans. If you go to the 1960s, it was already down to only 22.4% of Americans. If you go to modern times, like 2012, only 9.1% of Americans lived in poverty. And while starvation rates are surprisingly hard to find, we do know that by the 1940s, approximately 25% of military draftees showed evidence of severe malnutrition, i.e. they were starving. Because I think people don't realize, they just don't realize how many people used to starve or die of exposure. We were recently on the Jim Rett show. And you were talking about, he's like, oh, it doesn't really matter if we do a jubilee or we have some level of economic collapse. And you were pointing out, well...
He's like, well, it wouldn't be so bad if, old people just had to move back in with their kids. And I'm like, hold on.
You're like, one, a lot of them won't have kids to move back in with at this point. And two, if you look at the Americans right now who are living on social services, they have a huge amount, it's something like 80% of them live paycheck to paycheck, which means if they lost those social services, which often make up around 60% of their daily expenses, including things like food, housing,
childcare, healthcare for their kids. Yeah.
They're literally starving.
Well, and as it stands, these people do not have the ability to handle an unexpected $1,000 expense out of nowhere. And then suddenly way more than $1,000 in routine monthly basic survival expenses.
Yeah, so when he's like, oh, it doesn't matter if these systems collapse because in the 1900s we didn't have these systems. It's like in the 1900s, people starved to death regularly.
I was just listening to Planet Money did a little thing on the Great Depression, that podcast by NPR, and they were reading a first account from someone about their experience just seeing whole families out on the street with their babies, all of their possessions, like newborn babies, because they could no longer pay for rent. They lost absolutely everything and just couldn't. There was absolutely nothing for them. The government had absolutely no way to support them. you can bet a lot of people died, and a lot of very, helpless children and babies, which we're going to move on quickly because I cannot think about this. Change the subject. Okay, let's go.
Yeah, it's the situation.
All right. No need to change the subject. This is life on planet Earth. This is life for people. Part of when I think about SET and the calibration it does on our expectations. This is in a video of the Tocqueville paradox. When I think about how our expectations have been reset, what was basically the way most people lived a generation ago has been forgotten. And even here in this enormously wealthy United States, where even the poor have levels of food security and access to the entertainments and amusements that we have available to us, is all pretty fragile, and it can go away. And so I remember when I started work in the Dominican Republic, and those were much poorer people than in the United States. And I remember talking to my supervisor about, their situation. He says, we try to give the people something that, I'm going to rephrase it. He didn't say it this way. We try and give the people something that, let's say, the military shaking them down at a bus stop can't take away from them. And that's where, to me, if you want to give somebody something that cannot be taken away, whether they live a very short time of grinding brutality, or they live a long time of affluence, plenty, but then fall into, the whole point of this, which video was this?
The demographic of young people who had the highest rates of depression, anxiety, and substance abuse were in families of over $120,000 of average income, which is
right. And you see this with
upper middle
Spoonies
income.
too.
In one cohort, suburban affluent teens reported significantly higher use of cigarettes, alcohol, marijuana, and hard drugs than their inner city counterparts. So the suburban teens are doing more hard drugs than the inner city teens.
Would you like to know more?
Hello, Simone! Today we're doing another research-heavy episode because our audience loves these. I love counterintuitive research, and I love this.
Not misery, and who fails so badly at it while also dumping luxurious things.
And the tragedy it has created in this society.
Well, there's just something the Schadenfreude from specifically luxuriating in the misery of people whose core value is not misery and who fails so badly at it while also dumping on us constantly is just
they sacrifice everything else, every other value that a human could have
in the name of happiness, and then they're miserable.
Well, not happiness, but being able to seek after every biological instinct they have. Anything that they think will make them happy, they go pursue it. Anything that they would make them happy to believe about themselves, they have to have it affirmed. And they say we're monsters for not creating that cultural structure for our own children. They say, how dare you live the life you want to live? And then we look at them and they live a life of horror. Even when they're successful, even when they achieve everything they want, it's still a life of existential horror. Yeah. And that makes me so, I would be so hard to live in a world where the people who are unjustly oppressing you are living great lives.
Yeah.
Like I don't know, like God worked this out for us or whatever, but yeah. So this is something I decided to dig into after I noticed in a study.
All right. So that was the other video that they did that caught my attention over the last few weeks. And it's true. I see it all the time. You go back to the rest of history and just watch the episodes around Marie Antoinette. She should be living at the top of the world. And not only, it's just a fascinating look into what it's actually like to be a human being. And so, well, we're going to somehow do all of the arranging for human beings so that they can have what we imagine to be the optimized life. And then you begin to realize that, as Dostoevsky realized that, yeah, give them all of the stuff that they say they want, and they still don't know how to manage their life. All right, that's it. Leave a comment.